because there's no blue tag. Oh, they even took this one.
I moved it.
Next slide. Previous slide. Yeah, that's supposed to be yours.
welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight to this presentation. We're thrilled to have Father Ken Wasilewski with us. He's been with us a few times before, and we've always enjoyed him. I know people are happy to have him back. This time, actually, what got me thinking to ask him out again, I think was there's been a few occasions, but I know there was a men's ministry meeting where someone asked a few questions about some of the challenging issues that face our church, our world today. And there's some talk, why aren't those things addressed in homilies more? Well, some of them are, but all of them, it's not always that easy to get them into that little homily time. So, and plus, some of them are a little bit more complicated, and I thought this would be a better venue and get someone more adept at addressing these challenging things that face our church and our world, and to get the church's perspective, not just the secular perspective. And so, Father Ken's going to focus on a number of issues, some that you addressed in questions, others that I asked him to touch upon, and hopefully there will also be some time for some questions at the end. But I asked him specifically to address not only what the issues are, and not just what we teach, but also why we teach it, because I think when we get into why we teach it and how to apply it, I know for me, it always comes together better and makes more sense. So, with no further ado, I would like to introduce to you now Father Ken Wasilewski, our diocesan ethicist.
Right,
thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you all for having me out tonight. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great, wonderful. So let's go ahead and kind of get started. As Father Jones said, I'm Father Ken Wasilewski, the diocesan ethicist, and I wear a few other hats as well. One of the things that I've done for a number of years is I've taught at a nursing college in Rockford. And so in that nursing college, it's a Catholic nursing college, but we talk about all kinds of different medical and ethical issues dealing with nursing and healthcare in general. And only about 20% of my students are Catholic, which means that 80% are not, which means I get all kinds of different perspectives and all kinds of different opinions regarding all these different ethical issues. And so, if anything, that experience has taught me maybe to approach some of the issues maybe a little bit differently than simply in a strictly dogmatic sense, trying to explain why Catholics have these beliefs and what it means and how all of those different beliefs fit together. And so that's kind of what I'm going to try to do tonight. Now, I have a tendency to go off on tangents. Sometimes my tangents are really interesting. Sometimes they just get you lost. So if I need to pull back a little bit, I'll do my best to do that tonight. But we're going to be talking about really some contemporary issues like Father Jones said. And so let's just, because we're somewhat limited on time, I'm going to kind of be moving a little bit quickly. Trying to get through all the material so that we can have some opportunity for more questions at the end. If I'm saying something and it really isn't clear, feel free just to kind of stop me for a second and ask a question. That's perfectly fine if it's about something we're talking about. So this scripture quote from Genesis is the heart of the matter when it comes down to it. We should be all familiar with this scripture quote. It's really the heart of the matter of so many different life issues and respect for the human person, and it gives us so much indication in terms of our own human worth and the dignity of human life, but it really is a great place to start. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. This quote, all right, is near and dear really to so much of what the church teaches from an ethical standpoint. Right? A Catholic's moral life is really about living the truth of this message in its fullest, in its fullness. Right? It is the source of human dignity, the fact that we're made in God's image and likeness. If we are made in God's image and likeness, then it makes human life not just valuable, because even someone who doesn't believe in God might say that human life has value. It means that human life is sacred. And that puts it in a completely different category than other things that might also have value. And if human life is sacred, then it means it must be respected and treated properly. To do so is really what it means to live the truth about human life and human existence. It also means that we must live and uphold God's truth in all aspects of our lives. And at the same time that we're striving to do that, to encourage and to help others do the same thing. Truth doesn't contradict truth, or it's not truly true. All right? Now, that's just not a lot of fancy words strung together, but if we really stop and think about it, that's true. If I say something is true, all right, then it shouldn't contradict something else that is also true. And that, we'll see, is a very important thing to keep in mind when it comes to some of the issues that we'll talk about. The whole issue of truth really gets to the heart of the church's approach to human life, human dignity, and a lot of the contemporary moral issues as well. The quote, quid est veritas, if you're familiar with Scripture, right, this is what Pontius Pilate said to Jesus when Jesus was standing in front of him. Jesus said that he came to testify, to give testimony, to witness to the truth. And Pontius Pilate responds with the question, what is truth? And so that's where we kind of have to start when we're talking about some of these things. What do we mean by truth? We can say that truth is that which accurately describes reality. It's simply a statement of fact. It's what really is. Right? But we can also understand truth in three different ways. And this is a very key distinction to make. Because if we don't make this distinction, we very easily get sucked into kind of a nebulous place when it comes to talking about different moral issues. We can talk about objective truth. Right? Objective truth is true regardless of anyone's opinion or fact. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Right? Now that even today is controversial to some people, but that's what we mean by objective truth. Right? That it's true regardless of personal opinion or perception or anything else. It's just what is. This is the kind of truth that mathematics and that science really focuses in on. But we can also speak about something called contingent truth. Contingent truth is simply true in the right set of circumstances. So if I were to ask you what time is it, right, you look at your watch and say, oh, it's about 7:08. Right? Is that true? Yes. How long is it true? For about 1 minute, and then it's no longer true. All right? That's what we mean by contingent truth. It accurately reflects reality, but it takes a certain specific set of circumstances for that to be considered true. All right? And then we can talk about subjective truth. Subjective truth is all about me. It's my opinion. If I say chocolate is better than vanilla, well, that may be true for me, but that's just a matter of my opinion. Insofar as chocolate being better than vanilla accurately describes my opinion or my perception, then we can call that true too. Right? But it only applies to me. It's not objective any longer. It only applies to the person themselves. The problem that we have in the world, one of the problems, there might be 2 or 3 problems in the world, but one of the problems is a confusion of the kind of truth we're talking about. Because if I confuse subjective truth, my opinion, with objective truth, then whatever my opinion is becomes the way everyone else needs to see it. All right? And that's a problem if we don't make those distinctions. So I think early on, just to talk about these things are important. All right? Objective truth is not determined by us as human beings. Rather, it's discovered by us as human beings. Truth is determined by God. And talking again specifically about objective truth is something that God determines, not us. God helps us, God reveals it to us, God gives us the ability to understand it. That's part of being made in His image and likeness, is that we have the power of reason. We can understand things at a deeper level. So God helps us with that. But ultimately, it's grounded in God. We as human beings are fallible. We make mistakes. We get confused. We get things wrong sometimes. And that also means when it comes to understanding truth, sometimes we can be off. Sometimes something that I really, really want to be true or really, really think is true might be wrong. right? I mean, have you ever argued with the teacher, right, over something that you put on an examination or a test or a quiz or something, said, no, this answer's right, they can say, no, it's not. And no matter how passionately I believe it or argue my point, it doesn't change the fact. Right? And that's something that is also important to understand. So tonight we're going to try to cover a few contemporary issues in light of Catholic teaching. Right? I want to look at issues surrounding really the transgender issue. Right? I want to be looking at vaccines, and I want to be looking at abortions, politicians, and Holy Communion. And then if there's time left over for questions, we're happy to delve into other things as well. Now, any one of these things, we could take up the entire time talking about. And so that's why I'm going to be moving rather quickly. Additionally, because I'm going to be try to be moving rather quickly, I will make this PowerPoint available to anyone who wants it, so that if you want to go back and look at something that maybe I went rather quickly over, you're free to do so. Okay, so the parish already has the PowerPoint, so I'm happy to share with whomever wants it. So let's get started, all right? But when we talk about some of these first issues, just a little word about where some of the following information comes from, right? I'm going to kind of the sources of where some of these words and some of these terms are coming from. So the fact that I'm using them doesn't necessarily mean that I always, 100% of the time, would agree with some of these terms or terminology. Simply, this is how things are spoken of. All right? So I want to be clear about that as we go through. When we talk about transgender, what does that really mean? All right? Transgender means someone whose gender identity and sex at birth do not correspond, or a gender identity outside of male and female. Right? Now, that takes a lot of explaining to do, because already we're using all kinds of terms that might be unfamiliar to us. Right? So terms that are used in that definition, sex and gender, right? These are usually used, at least they have been until recent history, used more or less interchangeably. All right? If I said someone's sex or someone's gender, usually there's two choices there, male or female, right? Or man or woman. Now, however, many segments of society distinguish these terms, sex and gender. Right? Sex is now taken to mean male or female biologically, or male or female in a physiological sense. Right? So what you were born with, what your anatomy says, all right, what your chromosomes say. Right? That's typically how the term sex is used in some of these discussions now. Gender, on the other hand, refers to being masculine or feminine, or one's personal understanding of being masculine or feminine. Right? We'll see the distinction a little bit clearer as we go along. Right? So from this perspective, which is not necessarily the Catholic perspective, right? Biologic sex is based on one's body at birth, male or female. Gender identity is how one feels about themselves as being male, female, or masculine or feminine. Okay? So if we were to go back using the terms we've already used in terms of truth, we would say sex is an objective fact. But now in this conversation, in this ongoing issue, now suddenly gender identity is not necessarily always equal to sex, and therefore one's gender is no longer considered to be a biological fact or something from objective truth. Now it's in the realm of subjective. Right? Again, I'm not necessarily saying that this is what the Catholic Church believes, but this is the discussion, this is where the issue kind of is in society. Right? Hence, from this perspective, one's sex and one's gender need not correspond, which means that I can be a man but have a female body, or I can be female and have a man's body. All right? That's really what this is coming down to. If they happen to correspond, all right, in other words, if I have a male body and I identify as being a man or being masculine, then if those correspond, then they would be considered, that person would be considered what is now known as cisgender, all right? Which is something that was not in English vocabulary not that long ago. A lot of the words, a lot of the vocabulary is being made up as we go along, right? And so there are new terms and new words used to talk about things that previously just didn't exist in English, all right? If they don't correspond, if one's sex and one's gender do not correspond, then one might be considered or call themselves transgender or genderqueer or gender fluid. All right? And gender fluid simply means it can change. All right? So I might identify as being a man for this time in my life, and then I would identify as being a woman at another time in my life. All right? So the primary contention by those that consider themselves to be transgender, right, or who experience gender dysphoria, which is another term I'll talk about in just a second, is simply that their sexual identity was assigned to them at birth, being labeled as male or female. And in fact, this terminology, watch for this terminology, because it's already appearing in different commercials, like for different medications and things like that. Sometimes some of the warnings will be, this medication, if you were assigned male at birth, this medication, all right, may carry extra precautions with it, or extra side effects with it, or something like that. So this terminology is already kind of working into other areas of our world as well, all right? So the primary contention then is those that are transgender is simply that their sexual identity was assigned at birth, all right, being labeled as male or female. Instead, they believe it is something that they discover or choose for themselves, all right, what their gender identity is. And that these two things, their sex and their gender, need not correspond, all right? How many genders are there? Well, for us as Christians, there are 2. For Facebook, there are more than 50, all right? Do you think this might cause a little bit of confusion for people? All right? It does. And there's more being added all the time. All right? A few things to know, just when we talk about these things, all right? When we say someone is transgender, that does not mean that they're a transvestite. All right? Someone who is a transvestite is someone who has some pleasure or feels comfortable dressing in what would typically be considered the clothing of the opposite sex. Right? That's not necessarily someone who's transgender. Those are different things. There could be correspondence sometimes, but there need not be always. All right? So that transgender does not mean transvestite. We often will see the little abbreviation LGBT or LGBTQ. There's longer and longer versions of that now, but T in LGBT or LGBTQ stands for transgender. About 0.6 of the population would be considered or would consider themselves to be transgender. One of the scary things about the stats or what is known about people who are transgender is the incredibly high suicide rate. All right? About 40% of people who consider themselves to be transgender will attempt suicide in their lifetime, all right? Which is astronomically high compared to any other identifiable group, all right? And it's especially high for those who are born male and want to, or identify as being female, all right? It's especially high there. What's also interesting, and this is something when it comes to the ethics, all right? Some of the ethics around this involve children, for example. And many children actually struggle with some sense of gender dysphoria in their lifetime. Before puberty especially, or at the onset of puberty, sometimes there can be confusion about who they really are. You know, maybe I want to be the opposite sex, or maybe I'm more attracted to being the opposite sex, or something like that. So gender dysphoria, or being uncomfortable with one's gender, is really what gender dysphoria means, is something that is not entirely uncommon, among children, at least some degree of it here and there. But about 80 to 95% of children who identify or who experience gender dysphoria typically have it resolved naturally by the time that they're through puberty, all right? Which is an important thing to note when it comes to some of what is being talked about regarding children and transgenderism, all right? That most cases will resolve itself naturally just going through puberty, right? Gender dysphoria and gender identity disorder, all right, are two terms. I've already been using gender dysphoria quite a bit. Gender identity disorder is the same thing, but they're labeled differently for very important reasons, and we'll see why in just a second, all right? A change in wording in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, the 5th version of that, which the American Psychiatric Association put out in 2013, makes it a medical issue rather than a mental health issue. What this means is, previous to 2013, gender identity disorder was what you would call this issue, or what you would call this condition, right? But starting with 2013, it was no longer called gender identity disorder. Instead, it began to be called gender dysphoria, all right? The change is significant because the change then means that it is no longer a mental health issue, but rather a medical issue, right? That changes everything. Because instead of saying that one's perception of themselves as male or female is wrong, gender identity disorder would say that, instead of saying that, it becomes a problem of the body, right? What's wrong with this person is that they have the wrong body. They're really a man, but they have a woman's body. And that's the problem. The body becomes the problem, not the perception of self becomes the problem. Right? So I want to be very clear about that distinction because that's really driving a lot of the things that we're seeing. There's an insistence on affirming the person's self-perception, even if the biology says something different, even if the objective fact says something different, there's a focus on affirming the perception, even if that perception might be off. And that's where the change in the DSM, right, becomes so important, because taking it away from the mental health arena and placing it into the medical arena means that the way that we go about treating that is going to be completely different. All right? Since the body is the problem, then the focus becomes how do we fix or change the body, right, to correspond to the person's perception of self. Right? So if it was a mental health issue, then how do we change the person's thinking, or how do we go about helping the person to see that their perception is wrong? Any other sort of dysphoria that we would talk about, that would be the approach, because we would recognize, right, that the problem, the dysphoria, is being caused from a wrong or faulty perception. Right? So if someone has anorexia, you would never help that person by affirming that misperception of themselves and saying, yeah, you really do need to lose some weight. You would never, ever do that. Would be so incredibly harmful and cruel to do something like that. Right? We would always try to help them to see reality. Right? If we have bodily integrity identity disorder, which is when a person believes that some part of their body doesn't belong to them, so my arm isn't my arm, and therefore you need to cut it off, or I need to cut it off because it doesn't belong to me. That's a real disorder. If someone has it, you would never say, you're right, let me help you cut your arm off. You would never do that. Right? So this whole arena, when it comes to transgenderism, is a completely different take on how to deal with this dysphoria or this distress that people suffering from this have. Right? This change then has serious implications, because now, if it's a medical issue, we treat it through medication or surgery, right, to fix to fix the problem, because the problem is the body. They have the wrong body, right? Instead of counseling. Right? It would also prohibit certain types of counseling. Right? So there are laws which would prohibit a counselor from doing anything other than affirming that self-perception. You would never try to talk, at least legally, try to talk someone who is transgender out to think differently of themselves or their identity. You would simply affirm the identity that they come in with, that they perceive themselves as. So it means treatment is about affirmation of that perception, of that subjective perception, instead of trying to change it to see anything different. So there's all kinds of moral issues that this then creates by taking this approach, right? Because it means if we treat it medically through, for example, hormone treatments, it means that that person is going to have those hormone treatments pretty much for the rest of their lives, right? If that's the route that is chosen. Right? Possibly suppressing puberty in children, and this is becoming a growing issue where if a child expresses some sort of gender dysphoria, that the parents sometimes, or sometimes the doctors, would suggest hormone treatments to suppress puberty until the child decides what gender they are, and then you would offer whatever was appropriate to affirm their identity. Right? But we're talking about doing that in children, and the harmful side effects is very, very serious of doing that. I have a friend who's a doctor. She's a gastroenterologist for pediatrician who's a gastroenterologist. And she has talked many times to me about the issues that come in from children who are on some sort of hormone treatments, who are upsetting all their other systems in the body because of the hormone doses that are being taken to suppress puberty or to affirm their gender perception. And so all these other medical issues can be created simply by trying to affirm someone's subjective perception of their gender identity. Right? All kinds of, again, medical issues related to treatments. Surgery is mutilation. If one were to, and not everyone who's transgender does not necessarily take it to this level, but one option would be, if it's a medical problem with the body, is we change the body to look differently. All right? You can never make, it's impossible to make a male body be a female body or a female body to be a male body. You just can't do that, because at the cellular level, every cell in your body is either male or female. And so you can't change that, right? But what you can do is change the appearance of the body through surgery. Right? The problem is if you're destroying function or form of the body unnecessarily, then that ultimately becomes a form of mutilation. It also creates moral issues regarding participation in social activities or events or sports. And this is something that has been in the news a lot recently, in the last several months in particular, whereas in an effort, some people have taken on an effort to create greater equality, all right? That they would say, well, whatever gender identity you identify as, that's the team, the sports team that you'd be on, right? So if I'm a biological male, but I identify as being female, then I would play on the girls' team, right? You can see the problems that would create, perhaps, potentially, right? And in terms of also, in some instances, depending on the sport, what that might also mean for scholarships or things like that for student athletes. Also issues regarding bathrooms and locker rooms and all of that. That's been in the news quite a bit as well. Access to potentially vulnerable populations as well. You know, that if I'm biologically a male, right, and I'm volunteering somewhere, or if I'm staying somewhere, it might give me access. All right, if I identify as being a female, access to a vulnerable population because of that identity, right? And then, of course, there's all kinds of issues regarding pronouns and names, regarding how people want to be called. Right? So this is going to be a little bit hard to see, but I mentioned before that there's new language being created all the time. And so there's whole new sets of pronouns that are being incorporated into workplaces and into schools, right, to teach new ways, new pronouns, so that are more gender inclusive, they would say, or more gender neutral, right? And so instead of him or her, all right, now we have Z or C or A or they or te, all right, or A. And so there's all kinds of just inventions, all right, regarding the English language to identify, to be more gender inclusive, they would say. The church sees our bodies as being essential parts of our personal identity. Right? So our bodies tell us something about who we are. Right? Our physical bodies are an objective reality that cannot be changed. Right? Even if I want them to be changed, I cannot actually change from male to female. We can think of other physical or biological traits. Right? If I want to be 6'2", right, guess what? I'm not. Right? If I want to have a different color eyes, right, I can get contact lenses, but I can't change the color of my eyes. Right? If I want to be Filipino, right, I can want to be Filipino, but I'm not Filipino. Right? So there's all kinds of other physical or biological traits that we could look at that we don't have the power to change. No matter how much we may want to or desire that change, we can't necessarily change them. One of the main issues of contention when it comes to the issues of transgenderism is that of where our identity comes from and in what it consists. Does God give us our identity, right? Or do we determine it for ourselves? Granted, there can be some things that, yes, my choices do make an impact on who I become, right? On the things that I like or participate in. Yeah, so my choice can create a part of my identity, but at its root, who determines, right, who I am? What role does our body play in our identity? Who am I and how do I know? Okay, well, we would say, right, that God has gifted us with our bodies. And our bodies tell us something essential about our basic identity, our God-given identity. Going back to Genesis 1:27, male and female, he created them. Right? So our bodies tell us something very important about who we are. Transgenderism, right, kind of the philosophy that underlies it, transgenderism relies on a certain dualism between our bodies and our identity. We are not our bodies, right, according to that philosophy. Right? Christianity sees the person as a union of body and soul, not as things that are separate. Right? Only together, we would say, are we who we are. Right? The idea of a duality between body and identity is one that has existed in many, many forms over the years. We can go back to the very beginnings of Christianity, and there were different religious and philosophical movements like Gnosticism, like Manichaeism, all right, which proposed a certain duality in existence. All right, there were these two different realities. There was a physical reality, a spiritual reality, all kinds of different realities that were kind of set at odds with each other. Right? In more recent centuries, philosophically, we could look at the influence of what would be known as Cartesian philosophy, coming from René Descartes, and really Cartesian dualism. Descartes was the one who said, "I think, therefore I am." All right? And so from that, not that Descartes himself as a philosopher necessarily would have, gone down the path that future generations of philosophers would go, but simply that he introduced this idea that maybe I'm not just this, that maybe my mind is somehow separate from my body, right? And that's the ground of reality. This dualism between identity and body has really far-reaching consequences. Whether intentional or not, it ends up altering our vision of who God is. Right? If I determine reality, right, then what does God do? God is there to simply affirm my reality instead of me living God's reality. Right? My body then is not seen as something from him to reveal myself to me. God is no longer the author of my identity. I am by myself. I choose. I determine. Right? I make it the way it is. So it becomes not about accepting my identity, but rather asserting my identity. And there's a complete difference in those two realities. God either is or is not the creator of the whole person, not just certain parts of me. Right? The body remains, for us as Christians, essential to identity. We don't know ourselves apart from our bodies. So, what does all of this mean for the church, practically speaking? Right? Well, we would say a person is unable to change their sex, their gender. Right? You are what you are. Church records like baptism, right, are not going to be altered. Right? So that if someone was born and baptized as a boy, and later on they determine that they're actually a woman, we're not going to go back and change the baptismal records or anything like that. Godparents, right? There comes to be issues as a godfather, godmother, right? Fortunately, the church is kind of smart. It only requires one godparent who's a practicing Catholic. You don't have to have both, right? You only have to have one. So people in their own lives, they can assign however many godparents they want to their children. But from the church's perspective, you only need one. Right? You can have more than one, but you only need one. Right? Marriage is going to remain in the church's eyes between one biologic male and one biologic female. Right? Ordination remains a possibility for biologic males only. Right? So if you present yourself, if you're biologically a female and you present yourself to the vocation office and said, Father, I want to be a priest. I am a male, even though my body is female. They're going to say no, sorry. All right? It only remains a possibility in the Catholic Church for biologic males only. And again, I touched about this briefly before. Direct sterilization is not a morally legitimate option. It becomes a form of mutilation. Right? So the church is not going to see something like a sex change operation as it used to be called. Now it's called the sex affirming operation. Those things would not be allowed within the Catholic Church. Right? So what is a Catholic to do? As we confront any issue, we always start with God's love. It has to start there. Right? That's what we're called. We're called to be emissaries of God's love, missionaries of God's love, to whomever we encounter, especially those most in need of that love. All right? Oftentimes, we're the ones most in need of that love ourselves. We've got to be humble about that. But ultimately, we always start with God's love. So everything begins and ends with God's love and His truth. We must treat everyone with respect as a fellow child of God who is infinitely loved by God, regardless of their circumstances. Right? We must avoid intentionally hurtful speech. Tolerance is the truest, in the truest sense of the word, is the path. Now, when we often hear tolerance spoken in a secular setting, it means something very different than what it used to mean or what it really means in a Catholic sense. Catholics, for tolerance, what we mean is that I recognize there's a difference. Right? I don't buy into that difference. I don't have to agree with you. I just recognize that there's a difference, and I'm still willing to live with that difference. Right? You're not the same as I. We don't agree, but I'm still going to love you. Right? I'm not going to necessarily change my opinion, but I'm still going to act with kindness. That's really what tolerance is really about. Unfortunately, now when it's used, to be tolerant means that you have to fully accept and even celebrate whatever I say. All right? So if you don't buy into it, then you're not being tolerant. If you don't agree with me, then you're not being tolerant. But that goes completely against what the word actually means, which recognizes that there's a difference. Nevertheless, we treat with kindness even those that we disagree with. At the same time, we don't have to, and we shouldn't be forced to validate something that isn't true, or something that would contradict our own understanding of God or the human person. So, moving on to the next contemporary topic. Before I do, any questions about anything in that first topic? Yes? So, yeah, so cisgender just means that they match. All right, it's just a way of saying that they match. All right, so it's the same, basically. Cis would mean the same, ultimately. So biologic male means, and having a gender identity of being a man, they match. Therefore, one would be called a cisgender in this lexicon, in this new language that is developing. Yes? If you look at the actual numbers, there doesn't seem to be much of an increase necessarily, but there is an increase in awareness. There is also, it seems to be, I would dare say, an increase in popularity. And so I think the idea is becoming more mainstream. And so you have, in my own experience, what I've seen, encountered, and read about and all of that, you do seem to have more people questioning whether or not, you know, what their gender identity is. And so I think there's a lot of confusion because it's so out there that now it's suddenly, you know, who am I? Now there's all these different options and I've got to figure out which one I am. So I think it's creating some confusion. I don't think if you look at the numbers, there's actually that much of an increase per se, other than there's an increase in acceptance in many parts of society. Anything else? Yes? I'm sorry, is this suicide? Excellent question. So suicide typically would be considered a mental issue, a mental health issue. One could easily make that claim, that if we're not treating a mental issue as a mental issue, then are we really helping the problem? Are we really getting at trying to solve the problem, or are we simply circumventing the problem and perhaps creating another one? All right. Excellent question. Yes? Yeah. It's a great question in terms of where do we draw the line with using some of these terms. Right? I think you have to look at it from an aspect of prudence. I want to be familiar with them. I'm not necessarily going to use them, but I want to know kind of what they mean and where they're coming from. And so that's where I kind of am introducing it here. In terms of actually using them, when it comes to those pronouns, right now it's a big deal. All right? Pronouns are a really big deal for a certain segment of the population. I would say, in terms of just kind of a pastoral response, we are used to calling people by nicknames and by other names, even some of our saints. You know, we look at John Vianney, right? John Marie Vianney. Sometimes there's interchange there. I would not be personally, and this is my own opinion, this is not church teaching necessarily, I would not be so concerned about if someone wants to be called by a different name, being too offended to call them by that name, since I already do that in many instances where I call someone by a nickname or a preferred name, or they use their middle name instead of their first name. That to me isn't that concerning. I would be more concerned about giving into some of the other uses, like with the pronouns, kind of buying into that. That's where I would start to get more uncomfortable. Any other? Yes?
What do you find is being taught or should be taught in the local Catholic diocese?
Yeah. Right now, it's an excellent question in terms of what should be taught in the high schools. Right now, most high schools that I'm familiar with are still teaching Catholic anthropology, male, female. I think all of that is kind of where it is and where it's probably going to stay for the foreseeable future. I think it is helpful to a certain degree to have knowledge of some of this so that we can better understand what's being, because some of the kids who are going there, obviously they're getting information from outside of that school too. They're getting it from the internet, they're getting it from their other friends. And so they can be exposed to this information from other sources, which then can cause confusion. So I think being aware of this in high school, at high schools, I think is important, so that we can kind of dialogue with those students who are maybe asking some of these questions in a credible way. So, good question. All right. Yes?
Is that more of an issue with the
It could be either. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's an excellent question, because when it comes to some of the medical issues, let's say that a child is experiencing gender dysphoria and they're prepubescent. Let's say that they're, you know, maybe 10, 11, 9 years old, somewhere in that range. And let's say that, you know, let's say it's a little boy, but he thinks that he wants to be a little girl instead. Right? What is sometimes happening, what is distressing to some in the medical profession and among some pediatricians as well, is the parents are sometimes the one insisting that we do these hormone treatments to suppress puberty until my child figures out who they are, because they don't want to be seen as someone who's not affirming a different gender identity in their own child. And so sometimes it is the parents who are basically simply trying to affirm whatever their child says instead of give them direction. All right, good questions. Yes?
You and I meet on the street.
Uh-huh.
We have all of the pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to speak with you, but I don't want to play with the pronouns.
Yep.
You call me a racist.
Would I?
No.
Oh. Oh, I know.
I'm a racist.
Uh-huh.
How do I reconcile that without struggling with that?
Good question. Let me know the next time that happens, how it works. Because a lot of this is really uncharted territory. Because sometimes you can do everything that you think is reasonable and is right and kind, and still end up making a mistake that you didn't even know you made. And so in some ways, the odds are kind of stacked against people who are just wanting to be polite because someone else has this whole other idea of how you should act, and they're kind of imposing their view on you and judging you based on their opinion. And so that's where the pronouns can be so very confusing, and where I get very uncomfortable with all of it, because you're simply setting yourself up to be called a bigot or a racist or a transphobic or homophobic or anything else. Yes? Mm-hmm.
We're all created with God's image,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of how we're created.
Mm-hmm.
But we have chosen to label them.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that just wrong?
To put labels on
We're creating essential with ourselves.
mm-hmm.
Everybody labels. This is wrong, or this is right. So I'm confused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of by saying something is wrong or right,
What I'm saying is, if we hold Genesis statement to be
yep,
the Almighty truth,
yep,
and all things were created by God
mm-hmm.
in His image, and the child that was born with Y chromosomes and doesn't have X chromosomes is still the same
There, sure.
God's image.
Mm-hmm.
We come along and we put labels on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And we come along and we say, that's wrong, or that's right. That kind of finite, kind of leads to some of the things that are going on in this world, where everybody's labeling themselves, and we're creating these group of people here, these people here, they're pushing it up, because there's never any unity.
Mm-hmm. And I think going back to that Genesis, realizing that is going to be the ultimate source of our unity. In Catholic social teaching, we would call it solidarity. The idea that at the end of the day, we are ultimately made in God's image and likeness. At the end of the day, we have more in common than we have apart necessarily. Yep. All right. So, vaccines. All right. So, just check yeah, we're doing good. We might get halfway through this. So, so we'll see. Vaccines in general, we're just talking about any vaccine in general, right? They're generally seen in a very positive light by the church, right? As they can contribute really to the health of individuals and the health of society. They're seen as something that contributes to the common good, all right? And the common good, according to the Catechism, is understood as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. All right? So how do we make society work at its best? All right? That's really what we're getting at, the common good. So ensuring access to those things which are needed to lead a truly human life, things, basic things like food and clothing and health or health care, work, education, culture, all those kinds of things are all a part of that common good. For the vast majority of people in the developed world, right, who have access to vaccines, receiving them is seen as a way in which we can contribute to the common good. All right? It not only benefits the recipient in most cases, but also others in society who might be vulnerable. Right? There can be legitimate reasons, of course, why one might refuse a vaccine. For example, if there's some sort of a medical reason to refuse it, right? Or in some cases, reason of conscience. But refusing an available vaccine doesn't mean that we're exempt from the ethical obligation to continue to contribute to the common good, right? So I say, for whatever reason, I don't want any part of this vaccine, or I can't receive this vaccine, I still have to mitigate potential risk by maybe doing other things instead. Pardon me. Other efforts can be necessary then to counter the potential harm of not being vaccinated. Ethically, the Church's concern is not really about vaccines per se, but how they're produced and how they're distributed. That's really where the ethical concerns seem to come in. The Church would want there to be an equitable distribution plan so that those who are vulnerable or disadvantaged would still have access to the same vaccines that everyone else would have access to. The other big concern is how they're produced. That's where much of the attention and the controversy exists for example, the current COVID vaccines that are available. The primary concern is over any possible connection to abortion or tissues from abortion. So if we were to look at the 4 vaccines currently available, now I say 4, the AstraZeneca is kind of right on the cusp. It's available in some parts of the world, but not necessarily in the US, but I'm still kind of counting it as one of the ones that's out there. If we look at the 4 current vaccines, the 2, Pfizer and Moderna, they use mRNA, right? Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca use an adenovirus, all right? The Pfizer and the Moderna are designed in a laboratory not using human cells. Right? They basically just give your body the instructions or the recipe to make the antibodies to fight COVID. So there's no moral concerns over the production of the Pfizer and the Moderna. Right? Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, right, using an adenovirus, which basically means that there's a virus that is altered, basically taking the harmful part, the harmful code in that virus out, that is unable to replicate. Right? And then it includes the DNA sequence, which will make the protein, the spike protein, the COVID virus. Right? So the body then has the instructions to make the necessary antibodies for COVID. In order to make vaccines that way, though, you need living cells to support that adenovirus, that altered virus. This is where the first moral concern comes in for these 2 vaccines. Right? The cells used in the development of the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca made use of human cell lines that have a historical connection to an abortion years ago. Right? So basically what happened is this. Tissue was taken from an aborted fetus, all right, to create a cell line. All right? So those original cells are taken from that aborted fetus, and then a cell line is created, which basically means that those cells are plated and given what they need to survive and continue to divide, making more cells, generation after generation after generation, literally thousands of generations now from that original creation of the cell line. This process then kind of continues indefinitely for as long as that cell line exists. They will eventually degrade, but it typically is decades or many decades before they do. The current cell lines, as I said, are literally thousands of generations removed from those original cells, though genetically they're still related. Those cells are then used to house that adenovirus that is necessary to create the vaccine. The actual vaccines do not contain cells from those cell lines. Right? Those cell lines are simply used to keep that adenovirus viable. So what about the testing of the vaccines? The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines utilize those cell lines in question as a part of their testing phase. They wanted to test it on human cells to see what the reaction would be, and so they used some of those tainted cell lines or those questionable cell lines in that process. Essentially, after they were produced, they were tested on the human cells to see how they would react. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines were likewise tested on those questionable cell lines. A good place, if you want more detailed information, is an organization called the Charlotte Lozier Institute. They walk you through all the different kind of vaccines in development, all the different, more information than you could ever imagine regarding how these vaccines are produced and kind of what they include or what they don't, and any concerns in terms of a connection to abortion. The question then becomes one of cooperation. If there's a known historical connection to an abortion, is it morally acceptable to receive one of those vaccines? Okay, well, the Vatican, the USCCB, and other reputable voices like the National Catholic Bioethics Center have said yes, it is morally acceptable to receive one of those vaccines. But to understand the reasoning, it's necessary to kind of look at the instructions that they've offered, as well as an understanding of the principle of cooperation, just a working understanding of that. So if we want to look at the documents, the official documents from the church, there's a list of them there. All of the church documents utilize that principle of cooperation that I just mentioned. For the more contentious issues, it's important to have that knowledge of how it works. Right? So if we look at what is called the principle of cooperation, it provides us criteria to assess whether or not our cooperation is acceptable or the degree to which we might share in the wrongdoing of someone else. Okay? It can be a very difficult and sometimes complex principle to apply, though, because the circumstances can sometimes complicate things tremendously. To begin with, when we're talking about the principle of cooperation, we're talking about two agents, all right, which are either individuals or groups involved. All right? The primary agent, known as the principal agent, that's the person who's doing the wrong thing. They're the ones who are doing the evil thing, the bad thing, the sinful thing. And then the second agent is the cooperating agent. This is the person who is somehow either acting as an accomplice or they're somehow connected to that action of that first agent. There are two categories for cooperation, what is known as formal and what is known as material cooperation. Formal cooperation is when I'm a willing participant. Right? I want that evil thing to happen. I want to be a part of it. I want to see the end result of that bad thing. So I agree that that bad thing should be done. Right? So I choose to be involved, or I share the intention. I desire the same outcome. Formal cooperation can be either explicit or implicit. If it's explicit, then sign me up. Let me help you. I want this bad thing to happen so much that I'm willing to support it in any way that I can. All right? And it can take any number of different forms. Okay? An example would be if someone is going to rob a bank and I say, I'll help you, I'll drive the getaway car. Right? That's the kind of cooperation we're talking about here. Right? That kind is never morally justified. You can never be cooperating in that way. Implicit formal cooperation is a little less obvious. The cooperating agent, I can appear to disagree with the evil act, or even claim that I don't want it to happen, but my actions say otherwise. My actions actually, I'm still contributing. I still, in some level, I want it to happen. Maybe not as directly, but I still want it to happen. So if we were to look at the bank robbery example again, I may be asked to participate, and I say, no, I don't want to be that involved. You can borrow my car, but I'm not going to be the one to drive the getaway car. You can borrow my car, but I don't want to be that directly involved. So it's a little step removed, but you're still okay with that bad thing going on in some way. Another example would be when a politician claims to be opposed to an issue, let's say like abortion, but then they end up supporting it, all right, by voting for it. That would be another example of implicit formal cooperation. Right? It's also an unacceptable form of cooperation. Even though there's a little bit more distance or less involvement, you're still sharing the responsibility. Material cooperation, on the other hand, is a little different. Material cooperation is an unwilling participation. I don't want to be involved. I don't want that bad thing to happen. Right? But I'm still somehow connected to it. The cooperating agent doesn't want to be a part, but I can't fully or completely remove myself. Material cooperation can be classified as either immediate or mediate. Immediate material cooperation is when a person doesn't want to be involved, but I still fail to prevent it somehow. So maybe I knew that that bank robbery was going to happen, but I didn't call the police. I didn't stop it from happening. Right? Or I didn't want it to happen, but the bank robber, I hid them after the fact. All right? So I really don't want it to happen, but I'm not doing what I could to stop it or to distance myself as much as I should. Sometimes it can also exist this way. I don't want that bad thing to happen, but I want the results of that bad thing. And so I go along with it because I know it's going to benefit me somehow. Even though I really don't want that bad thing to happen, I'm still going to benefit somehow. So I kind of turn a blind eye to it. Someone guilty of immediate material cooperation might know that it's going to happen, but doesn't alert the authorities, or they offer that robber a place to hide. It is also, as I said, something else that we could do that stop it that we choose not to do. Right? That's also an unacceptable form of cooperation. Right? Finally, the last category is known as mediate material cooperation. And with this kind, right, I don't want that bad thing to happen, but I'm powerless to remove myself completely. I can't do anything to stop it from happening. I'm doing everything I can, I'm just powerless to stop it. Right? A classic example of this would be something like paying taxes. Right? There's no reasonable way that you can avoid paying taxes. Right? You can try, but then you're going to go to jail. Right? So that's not a reasonable way to exempt yourself from that. Nevertheless, some of our tax dollars, no matter where we find ourselves politically or anything else, some of our tax dollars are going to support something that we end up disagreeing with. Right? So that, if I pay my taxes, then I'm cooperating at a material level, and it's mediate material cooperation. Right? It's the one form of cooperation that can be morally acceptable, right? At least in some cases. I first have to look at, though, before I can say that it is, are there reasonable alternatives which would remove me completely or would involve less or would include less involvement? Or how close am I to that evil thing actually happening? Am I really close to it, or I'm pretty far away from it? I also have to look at the issue of scandal, all right, which means in this context, bad example that causes confusion in other people, or bad example that causes someone else to do something wrong. Right? Sometimes my behavior can be acceptable, but it can be perceived as contradictory or problematic. So that has to be kind of factored in there. There also has to be a serious reason or proportionate reason to be involved. Going back to paying taxes, it would meet all of those categories. All right? We could also think of immediate material cooperation in terms of degrees of separation. How many degrees of separation exist between me and that evil act? Right? The more degrees, the more morally safe I am, the less moral responsibility I could say I would have. So if we were to look at the COVID vaccines or any other vaccines, right, through that lens, which is what the church is looking at, right? If we looked at the Moderna and the Pfizer, no moral problems with the development, only a concern over the testing, all right? Just that fact alone is already a huge degree of separation in terms of any responsibility that I would have. Does the person receiving the vaccine agree with the abortion that created those cell lines that were later used to test, right? If yes, right, then you're in formal cooperation if you agree with that abortion happening. Right? If you say, no, I don't agree with that abortion happening, then I'm in material cooperation. Right? But which one? Well, I have to ask some other questions. By my receiving that vaccine, does my receiving it make the abortion happen? Right? If we say no, okay, well then it's probably a little bit safer. Does receiving the vaccine allow that abortion to happen? In other words, is it happening because I'm receiving this in some way? Right? Or if I refuse the vaccine, is it going to stop the abortion? Right? What relationship exists between vaccination and that abortion? Right? In this case, there's not a direct line. There's a historical connection, but there's not a direct line between the two. Right? How closely related are they? We're talking not only years, but really thousands of generations separating those two things. Is there a proportionate reason to receive the vaccine? The Vatican, the Church would say absolutely because of the health concerns regarding it. Right? So if we look at all of those and similar questions, right, we can see why the Vatican would conclude that when it comes to the Moderna and the Pfizer, that there exists a very, very remote material cooperation, and that given the pandemic, there's more than ample proportionate reason which exists to be vaccinated. Furthermore, with proper instruction, there's not a serious risk of scandal. Right? Therefore, one can receive either of those vaccines without any serious moral guilt or responsibility. When it comes to the Johnson & Johnson or the AstraZeneca, right, again, there's concerns over the development and the testing. Right? Because we've already looked at the connection which exists between the testing, right, we'll just focus on the development question for these. Here again, Vatican uses the same kind of reasoning. Right? Does the person receiving the vaccine agree with the abortion? Right? The same questions we looked at before. If yes, then you're in formal cooperation and you're partly responsible because you're agreeing with that evil act. You wanted that thing to happen. If no, then you're in the realm of material cooperation. But again, which one? You have to ask the same questions. Does my receiving it make that abortion happen, or does it contribute to it happening? Does receiving it allow it to happen? Does not receiving it prevent it from happening? Does one want that abortion to happen so that vaccines can be made from cell lines? What relationship exists between vaccination and abortion? How closely related are the two? Is there a proportionate reason to receive the vaccine? Does the vaccine contain any of those cells derived from that abortion? Okay? Once again, the Vatican concluded that even with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we're still in the realm of remote material cooperation. Right? It's not as remote as the Pfizer or Moderna, but it's still in the morally acceptable realm of cooperation. Furthermore, there would still exist a proportionate reason to receive it. Wanting to distance ourselves as much as possible would mean a preference for whatever vaccine is the furthest removed, but thus far, any of those available would still fall in the category of moral acceptability. A few other points that the Vatican addresses in those considerations. We also have a responsibility to make our objections known, even to the testing. We also have different levels of responsibilities for those involved. For example, those who were originally involved in the abortion have the most moral guilt, most moral responsibility. Those who created the cell line from that fetal tissue also share a great deal of responsibility. Those who develop and produce the vaccines utilizing those cell lines have more responsibility. Those who are involved in marketing would have a little bit more responsibility. Those who receive them are the very tail end. They would have really no moral responsibility when it comes to that. When would it no longer be acceptable to receive a vaccine because of the proximity to abortion? Right? Hypothetically, all right, let's assume that the ongoing manufacture of the vaccine required fresh fetal tissue with every batch. So in order to make more vaccine, you had to have more fetal tissue, which means you have to have more abortion. Then we're starting to get in the area where now it's not just remote, now it's much, much more close, much more proximate, to use the proper language. Right? That would create an unacceptable situation. Right? Likewise, it would be more problematic if there was a specific abortion which was undertaken so that a particular vaccine could be developed. So we're going to say we're going to have this abortion so that we create a cell line for this vaccine, then that's also likewise much more proximate, much more close. There's much more concern over something like that. Right? So moving on to the last topic that was requested. Before I do that, questions regarding vaccines? Yes? Yeah, they can. And that's, what's that? It is. It's the cell lines that are created, they can be made from any human tissue. Fetal tissue is especially what do I want to say, productive or effective in creating those cell lines, but they can be made really out of anything. The problem is they tend to be very difficult and expensive to create. And so the manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies are like, why invest all this extra money creating a new cell line when this one works well, has a good track record, and it's readily available? In some cases, the pharmaceutical companies actually own the cell lines, so they don't have to pay royalties or anything else like that to use it. So it becomes kind of an issue of convenience and an issue of money in terms of why we don't have more cell lines or why we don't insist on more ethically produced cell lines, but it's entirely possible to do so. Right? There are some cell lines out there that are, that are created that way, just that most of the pharmaceutical companies are utilizing kind of the same ones that they've been utilizing for a long time. Excellent question. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So Catholic politicians and communion. All right. It's been an issue for some time. All right. Really going back several decades, but especially in the last 20 years or so, it's become increasingly contentious. Right? It's an issue in other countries as well, but it's especially on the radar in the U.S., and it has been for a number of years in the U.S., but especially since President Biden was elected. Right? It seems like it's really back in the forefront once again. And several high-profile politicians claim to be Catholic and practice the Catholic faith, yet publicly support things like abortion or other morally problematic issues. Right? There are typically three basic responses that Catholics take. Right? The first response is, anyone who comes up to communion should be able to receive it. All right? Don't worry about anything else. If they're coming up, they should be able to receive it. That's the first response that some people take. The second is, there need to be consistent and universal refusals for those who are public figures and support evils like abortion. So if they're a politician or a public figure and they're known to support abortion or some other moral evil, you should just refuse carte blanche. They should not be allowed to receive communion. The end. All right. The third response is, it's a little bit more complicated than either of those. Recently, there have been some notable comments made by some of the bishops and cardinals about this issue. Very recently, like the last couple of weeks, maybe some of you have seen or encountered some of this. Right? This is also leading up to the U.S. bishops meeting in Washington, D.C. in June of this year, where among other topics that are going to be discussed is this issue, is the issue of Catholics in public life who openly violate church teaching on serious moral matters like abortion and euthanasia, right? In the hopes of having some sort of consensus or discussion about how we should do this, how we should handle it. Two of the big names recently have been Archbishop Corleone, the Archbishop of San Francisco, and Cardinal Luis Ladaria, who is the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the Vatican. The CDF, that's what, if you remember a number of years ago, before he was elected Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger was head of the CDF for a long time, Pope Benedict XVI. So Archbishop Corleone recently wrote a pastoral letter entitled, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you," a pastoral letter on the human dignity of the unborn, Holy Communion, and Catholics in public life. Right? And there's a link. You can go and read that if you wanted to, or you could go to the Archdiocese website, and it's right on the main webpage. You can read it. It's not that long of a read. But I first heard of this actually on a secular news station, right? Because it created such a stir when he released it, because of kind of the conclusions that he draws, that it really made kind of national news for a day or two anyway, when he first released it. In that, he breaks it down into 4 different topics that he talks about. Right? He talks about the gravity of abortion, how serious it is. He calls it a preeminent priority because it denies the most basic of all rights, which is the right to life. And that he says that Catholics on this issue are called to be a voice for the voiceless, that we should be leading the way publicly, denouncing this practice and advocating for the unborn. Right? Number 2, he talks about cooperation and moral evil, which is something that we just talked about regarding vaccines. Right? But he mentions, or he notes, that the woman seeking the abortion is not the only one responsible, that there's a whole string of people who are responsible with any abortion. Right? He said it would include anyone who pressures or encourages her, or gives her information, or pays or supports that abortion, or supports legislation for abortion, or the abortion doctor or workers themselves. Right? They all share responsibility. Right? Number 3, he talks about the meaning of choosing to receive the Holy Eucharist. Okay? And in that he talks about the seriousness of receiving Holy Communion. He looks at it historically, going all the way back to the early church, and how serious they took it, and how if you weren't living according to the Christian lifestyle, then you weren't allowed to receive communion, or you were discouraged to receive communion, and all the things that could prevent someone from receiving. So he kind of looks at it from, it's not that long of a section, but he looks at it from kind of a historical perspective. Right? And he basically says that those who reject the church's moral teaching, right, should not be receiving the Eucharist. Right? That there's all kinds of people who are excluded already from receiving the Eucharist, and so people who reject publicly the church's moral teaching should also not be able to receive. Right? And then the 4th section talks about the responsibilities of Catholics in public life. And he says that public Catholics have very serious responsibilities, especially, he says, to witness to the truths of the faith. That the fact that you're a public voice, a public figure, gives you greater responsibility to defend the faith and to promote the faith and to uphold the faith, right, in whatever work you're involved in. Right? And that you are called in a special way to witness to the truth of the faith, including the truth of human dignity. He says that there's also a risk of scandal when they fail to witness to or oppose the church's teaching, right? Which means that they have the risk of casting doubt on what the church teaches about abortion and what the church teaches about receiving the Eucharist. And then he concludes his pastoral letter with an invitation to live the church's teaching fully, and an invitation for any who may not be to come back and to be a part of the church fully again. The other person I mentioned was Cardinal Ladaria, Luis Ladaria. He issued a warning to the U.S. bishops, all right, who are going to be gathering in Washington for that meeting. One of the topics slated, of course, is this whole issue of Catholics in public life. And so in his communication, Cardinal Ladaria stressed the following points. He kind of preempted the meeting saying, okay, if you're going to be talking about this, keep this in mind. Right? These are the things you need to think about. He says that any such policy requires dialogue in 2 stages. The bishops have to talk about it themselves, and then a bishop and any politician in his jurisdiction also have to discuss it. And he said that a policy cannot usurp an individual bishop's authority in his diocese. So you can't make a national policy that strips the bishop from being able to do things in his own diocese according to the way that the church allows him to do that. So you can't, in a sense, tie their hands across the board if you create a policy like that. It could also, he said, be misleading if it was only focused or concerned with the evils of abortion or euthanasia. Right? He said you would also have to think about other potential grave issues that might also exclude someone from communion, not only these 2. He also said that it could end up being a source of discord rather than unity among the bishops and the faithful. It could be a source of division, where we're dividing the church further, especially in those areas or those segments where there's already division going on. He said this could drive the wedge even further. He said that any such discussion would best be framed about the worthiness to receive communion in general rather than singling out a specific group. He says, so any discussion that goes on, think about how you would apply this to any Catholic instead of only to a certain group. And then he said a policy should also include dialogue with other Episcopal conferences for input. All right, so talk to other countries and their Episcopal conferences, how they deal with it, to have some unanimity among countries or among Episcopal conferences. So, what I would say regarding this is don't expect there to be an immediate change in practice anytime soon. All right? Even if when the bishops meet, you're probably not going to see an immediate sweeping change across the board. Most likely, there's going to be debate and policy proposals at this stage. Any official policy that the U.S. bishops might develop still has to be approved by the Vatican, and that can take a lot of time. Expect to see lots of news stories, though, where bishops and priests do refuse public figures communion who support abortion or other morally problematic issues. You probably, in the last several years, probably have encountered news stories where a priest or a bishop does refuse someone communion, and there's usually a firestorm regarding those actions. So what is a Catholic to do amidst all of this? Well, refusal to admit someone to communion is ultimately the local bishop's responsibility. Right? And that's kind of how the church has set it up. So that if someone is going to be denied communion publicly, then the bishop either has to give his approval or has to be involved in some way. The bishop can tell the priests, yes, you can do this, but it still has to come from the bishop before it's supposed to happen. The only way that a Catholic can be refused communion normally would be after attempts have been made or conversations had to clarify the situation. All right? So again, that would usually be done with the local bishop, but it could also be with the pastor, for example. And so they would confront the public person, have a conversation, be sure that they're understanding church teaching and what the church says about receiving communion, understand what their position regarding these moral issues are. Once that conversation happens, then and only then would the bishop normally give a yes or a no to refusal. Right? Refusal at the altar is typically not the place to have that conversation. Right? It has to happen before, at least it's supposed to happen before. The only time that a pastor or a priest or a deacon or a lay minister should refuse someone communion in most circumstances is if they clearly appear to be ineligible. For example, they're too young, and I've had that many times. I've had like a 2 or 3-year-old come up and want what I have in that ciboria, and I'm not going to give it to them. I even had one little girl one time demand that I give her teddy bear communion, and I refused that teddy bear communion. Right? So there can be certain circumstances, or if it's clear that someone is not Catholic. All right? There's discrete ways in which you can kind of handle those situations, but it would have to be something that obvious that they're ineligible to receive before there would be any sort of a refusal in normal circumstances in a parish. The moral responsibility, all right, the moral responsibility lays primarily with the person receiving and the local bishop. All right? So the bishop, if this is an issue in his diocese, has a responsibility to address it. And the person who is in question has a responsibility to examine their conscience to see if they should or should not be receiving communion. Right? That's where the moral responsibility primarily lies. All right. Questions about this or about other topics? We have just about 5 minutes or so left. Are there any questions? Question in the back, yes.
Or in regards to abortion,
Yep.
is it better for a mother and child to have prayer, or better to have a back alley abortion?
I'm sorry, better to have what?
A back alley abortion without medical care. And I'll just cite one story. Next door neighbor of mine, not now, was an appraiser. They went into a home in California, very large home. That was on the market. They found 1,000 aborted babies. That an abortion wasn't legal.
Mm-hmm.
They have a better chance with prayer.
With prayer?
Mother and baby have a better chance with prayer.
Any other? Yes, question. Question about gluten-free hosts. To my knowledge, the low-gluten hosts are as far as the church is willing to go at this point. So there is the option, in some cases, to receive only the precious blood. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, at this point, to my knowledge, there's no serious consideration of changing to a completely gluten-free. The low gluten is as far as they're willing to go at this point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes?
So, President Biden came here.
Uh-huh. Father Jones would have to consult the bishop, and the bishop would have to make the determination.
Yeah, they have foreknowledge that he's going to be here on June 15th for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
They have to discuss it.
Yep.
But they have, the bishop has the authority, the priest has the authority to say no.
Yes. The priest is not supposed to act without the bishop's approval. That's where sometimes you have issues where a priest will on their own decide to do that without any discussion with the bishop. So the priest can be empowered by the bishop to refuse. But what's that? Was there a follow-up or a? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this one came from you, he refused, but I thought he had some communication with the bishop about it.
Yeah, they would need to. Otherwise, they're kind of setting themselves up for trouble. Mm-hmm. They may still, if they, even with the bishop's approval, they're still going to be a bad guy in some of those situations. But at least then they're acting in accord with the local bishop. Yes.
So are you saying that the church is not going to take a position on let's say, on abortion?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to leave it up to the local bishop?
No, the local bishop will determine how best to apply what the church teaches. And so that's where we get into some of the kind of almost the wordsmithing here of how we're going to handle it. Because what the church says is that someone who is conscious of a mortal sin should not receive communion. Right? Or anyone who is involved in an ongoing state of sin should also not receive communion. That's what the church teaches. But the church also tends to leave that up to the person's conscience, whether or not they present themselves, because on a given Sunday, I may not have any idea who's coming up to receive communion or what state of their soul is in. So I'm relying on them to have examined their conscience, and only if they deem themselves capable of receiving are they coming forward. It gets problematic if someone is a public figure and has made public statements about this, whether or not they're really disposed to receive communion. And that's where it gets very tricky. So the church says if you're conscious of a grave sin, or if you're in a state of perpetual sin, then you should not receive communion until you've gone through a conversion, rectified that, gone to confession, something like. You have to somehow make that right before you should present yourself. Excellent question. In vitro fertilization, why does the church deem it as unacceptable? There's several different moral issues. The first thing the church would recognize is that the value, the dignity of any child, regardless of how they're brought into the world, is the same. So a child born of IVF has the same amount of dignity and worth as any other child. It's never a question about the worth of the child. It's always about how that child is produced. That's where the moral issue lies. And so with in vitro fertilization, the major moral concerns are around embryo loss and a breach of the marriage covenant. Embryo loss, when you look at the numbers of embryos that are created, some of which are disposed of, some of which are lost in the process, some of which may end up being frozen, that those embryos, to produce one child, you're looking at the loss of many, many embryos, known losses going into it. So embryo loss is a big factor why the church would say no to IVF. The other factor affects the marriage covenant, because when you look at who is conceiving that child, it's not the couple themselves who are conceiving it. It's being conceived through the hands of other people who are not in that marriage covenant. And so in a sense, you're introducing other people into what should be an exclusive relationship in terms of the creation of that child. That's another moral issue. There's other issues as well regarding issues of surrogacy, of using donated sperm or eggs. So there can be other issues that are involved there too, but those are really the two main ones for IVF, is the loss of embryos and then also the marriage covenant aspect. So, yeah. Oh no, like I said, an IVF baby is still seen 100% with human dignity, everything else that any child would have. The question is never about the child, the worth of the child. It's always about the technique. That's where the moral assessment lies. And so an IVF baby absolutely could be baptized. Anything like that, not an issue. Yes? On organ donation. The church's position on organ donation. The church, by and large, sees it as a generous thing, as a good thing, but something that requires informed consent, and sees it as potentially an act of charity where I would, in a sense, allow my body to be used, or parts of my body to be used to help someone else. The only issues that the church would have with organ donation would be, and this is just being sure that these are taken into consideration, that you would not you'd want to be sure that whoever was determining death was not also part of the transplant team, so that there's a degree of separation there, so that there's not a chance that, okay, we really need these organs. And so the other kind of moral concern there is that the person is given their own death, that that death is not sped up in any way in order to get to those organs, but that person is still allowed to die with the proper decorum that any other person would be allowed to die with. right? That they never become just an organ donor. They're always still a person first. But otherwise, the church would have, would see organ donation primarily in a positive light. Any other last questions? In that case, can I pray with you? And then give you my blessing, and then we can be done for tonight? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity this evening to come together to talk about these sometimes confusing and difficult topics. Help us, Lord, with your Holy Spirit, who is the one promised to lead us into all truth, to live the truth as best we can in our lives, to witness to that truth, and to share that truth with as many people in the world as we can. Lord, help us, especially when it's difficult or confusing. Grant us your peace and your solace. Help us and lead us and guide us on our way. Lord, we ask your help. We thank you so much for your gift of life and for all the many gifts you've given to us and to our church. And Lord, we pray together, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go forth in peace. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you very much. God bless you.